Hi everyone. Thought I'd try something a little special. I hope you're going to enjoy it. But when I was a little girl, I read a book called Charlotte's Web. And I don't know if any of you have read this book or had it read to you when you were even younger than you are now. But if you haven't, it's a really an incredible book about friendship and supporting each other. And I thought there's 22 chapters in it. And I thought what I would do is each night read you two chapters until we get to the end of the book. So, if my math is correct, it will take about 11 nights to get through this book together. And I'm hoping that you enjoy taking this journey with me. So, Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Chapter 1 Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arable. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8 years old. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. He's very small and he's weak and he'll never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it!" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you'll have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself?" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. "Fern," said Mr. Arable, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it?" "If I'd been small, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said, looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," said Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice that I have ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I'll bring the runt when I come in. I'll let you start it on a bottle, just like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable, and Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place at the table. Then they walked to the sink and washed their hands and dried them on a towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled. There was a scratching noise, and Fern looked at her father and lifted the lid off the carton, and there inside, looking up at her, was the newborn pig. It was a white one. A morning light shone through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arable, "saved from an untimely death. And may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, then she kissed her mother. Then she opened the lid again, lifted the pig out, and held it against her cheek. At this moment, her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed with an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" "She has a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arable. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, setting down his gun. "You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be along in half an hour." "Can I have a pig too, Pop?" asked Avery. "Nope. I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. Fern was up at daylight, trying to rid the world of injustice, and as a result she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. It just shows you what you can happen if you get out of bed promptly. Let's eat. But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and a rubber nipple, and she poured warm milk into the bottle. And she fitted the nipple over the top and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. And look at the cute picture of Fern sitting there feeding the pig. A few minutes later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a donut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another donut. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to have entire charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pig, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern, and the pupils all giggled, and Fern blushed. Chapter 2, Wilbur. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to pet him, to feed him, and to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. And every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out, ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away in school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He'd stand and gaze up at her with adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. And then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. And at 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer, and Mr. Arable fixed a small yard especially for Wilbur under an apple tree, and gave him a large wooden box full of straw, with a doorway cut in so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "Nope," said Father. "You watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. And when he finished every last drop, he grunted and he walked sleepily into the box. Fern peered through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout. In a short time, he had dug a tunnel in the straw, and he crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was enchanted. It relieved her to know that her baby would sleep all covered up and would stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road and Fern and waited with her until the bus came. She'd wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished around a turn. While Fern was in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she would take him out and he would follow her all over the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went into the house. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom step until she came down again. If she took her dolls for a walk in the doll carriage, Wilbur followed along. Sometimes on those journeys, Wilbur would get tired. So Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage beside the doll. He liked this. And if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked so cute when his eyes were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly so as not to wake her infants. I just want to show you the picture. Isn't that the cutest little thing? With her baby doll and her baby pig in the carriage. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged along at Fern's heels, and when she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking. So while the children swam and played and splashed water at each other, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and oozy. Every day was a happy day. Every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means he was born in the springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arble said that he was now big enough to sell, and he would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, but her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased. He was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to milk. Mr. Darble was not willing to provide for him any longer. He'd already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. "He's got to go, Fern," he said. "You've had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer. He has got to be sold." "Call up the Zuckermans," suggested Mrs. Arble to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." "How much money should I ask for him?" Fern wanted to know. "Well," said her father, "he's a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer that you've got a pig that you will sell for $6 and see what he says." It was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer, and Uncle Homer came in from the barn and talked to Fern. When he heard that the price was only $6, he said he would buy the pig. And the next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of Zuckerman's barn. And that's where we're going to end for today. And tomorrow I'll read you chapter 3 and 4. So I hope you enjoyed it. Good night.